So 2 years ago, we covered half of our vegetable garden with wood chips. And I just got my soil test back from the lab. So we did a soil test of this half of the garden that's had wood chips on it for 2 years, and the other half of the garden which has not had any wood chips on it. The interesting thing is both sides of the garden have been treated the exact same, meaning I have not applied any type of, I actually haven't even applied compost, and I didn't apply any type of composted manure, any type of amendments to the soil. So they both started from the exact same state. The only difference is this one has had wood chips on it and no tilling for 2 years versus this side. Now, when we initially did this, if you watch the video where I shared the 1 year results, you can go and catch that and watch that video after watching this one. But 2 years later and actually having the soil results back from a lab has been very interesting. My initial fear, or concern I should say, with covering part of the garden with wood chips, and was also my husband's concern, which is why we did half and half to test it, is I was worried about nitrogen being tied up or the wood chips using more of the nitrogen in the soil as they began to break down. Now, a lot of the research and stuff that I had read said as long as the wood chips weren't worked into the soil, they were just on the top layer of the soil, that they wouldn't consume too much of the nitrogen in the soil, which would affect obviously then my harvest yield from a lot of the garden plants. So when I first put this layer of sawdust down, I did do a layer of cardboard, and yes, I know that cardboard can have stuff in it that you may not want. I had cardboard down in the garden. So I'm fine with that. You do whatever you want in your garden when it comes to the cardboard. We just put one layer down to act as weed suppression, and then we put the wood chips on top. And I don't have any plans of using any more cardboard on the garden. It was just for that initial weed suppression route as we were first getting this started. So the wood chips went on after that, and as far as weed control, it's been really, really good. And I didn't really notice any yield differences per se with the crops that I had here. Like, they all did pretty good. I got a good yield on them. But I have to say, at the end of last year, at the end of the garden season, it did seem like some of the plants weren't growing quite as much as they should be. And for me, that's usually a sign that they don't have enough nitrogen if they really seem stalled in their growth and the weather conditions are good. And the other parts of the garden were doing well. But it did seem that some of the crops that were on this part didn't grow quite as fast or as much as I was used to them growing. So we did the soil test. So the results for this part of the garden, which these wood chips, now ideally when you're doing a wood chip method or a back to Eden style of gardening, is I should have put down a layer of compost and then a new layer of wood chips on top of that. But there's also real life, and I just did not get around to putting a whole layer of compost over this entire layer of the garden. One is, usually when I work compost into the garden soil where it's not been wood chipped, I usually work it into where I'm planting, like my planting rows. But for here, it's recommended that you just do it all over the whole top of the entire area. And I didn't have that much compost. We have a decent compost pile, and I do have some compost that I'm going to be putting in where I plant this year and amending the soil now that I know my results. But that requires a lot more compost than I'm used to. I don't want to buy compost either. I much would rather be able to just use our animals and the stuff that we have on the farm to make our compost pile. But that would require me to make a lot more compost than I'm used to doing. So I need like a drum roll. The results for the wood chip part. My nitrogen is very low. It's actually almost to medium, but it is in the low range. So it goes from low, medium, high to very high. So my nitrogen, which is the nitrate N, is at 11 ppm is the exact level, which is at the higher end of low, but it's still low. All the other micronutrients that are in soil, which if you're not familiar with all of those, I have a blog post and I also have a guide, if you have my family garden plan, a detailed guide that goes through all of these macronutrients to your soil, what they mean to plants and levels, as well as how to amend them using organic methods. So I will link to that in the video description below here so you can check that out and further. But everything else is really good level-wise. So it's either very high, medium, or high for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, boron, sulfur, and organic matter. And we like to have a high level of organic matter because, one, that's going to help the organic matter as those things break down, as the organic matter breaks down into your soil. They also give, the soil testing company that I used is called Simply Soil Testing. They're local to me, but you can do it online and mail in stuff. So I'll have a link to them. They're not sponsored. They're not sponsoring me or paying me to say any of that. It's just who I use. They were the best price that I could find. But back to organic matter. So it's beneficial because it holds moisture and nutrients, and then as the nutrients in that organic matter begins to break down, it's going to continue to release nutrients back into the soil. So that's why we like to have a lot of organic matter in soil. One of the reasons that we like to add compost in, it helps with aeration and water retention and lots of good things. So I was pleased to see that this soil still had a large amount of organic matter, but my nitrogen is pretty low. So I know how to amend for nitrogen. I've got some composted chicken manure and some compost that I will be putting in. We planted a few things here. I planted my peas, which peas don't require a lot of nitrogen because peas will actually help fix nitrogen back into the soil, but there does have to be some nitrogen present. But I did add compost and where I planted this peas, which those are coming up. And then here I've got beans, kind of the same thing. I've had brassicas here, and then I had squash, and then I had root vegetables. I had my onions here last year, so as far as crop rotation goes, it's time to be putting back beans and peas in this area, which is good because as far as crop rotation goes, I should be low on nitrogen, but I don't like to be as low as I am right now. So I added compost, which you can see here because obviously it's darker in its soil. It's not just the wood chips, right through here where I planted the beans. And so I probably will, there's a little bean seed that actually did not get buried. So I'll have to push him down further there in a minute. But I will be adding a little bit of chicken manure, just a small amount because beans don't need a lot, but just a small amount. I'm going to top dress with a little bit of chicken manure, and the rain will help wash that down in there for that. So I'm not too displeased with the results. I do need to add nitrogen. I haven't added anything to the soil for nitrogen in 2 years. So it's not really atypical, but here's the but. Now we need to look at our soil results for the main garden where we have not used any wood chips and we have still been tilling. So let's go there. So now remember, same soil, 2 years, exact same treatments, different results. So this area of the garden, my nitrogen level is on the high end of medium, so it's 24 ppm. So that's more than double. It's almost to the high level. So I don't need to add any nitrogen to this half of the garden. All of my levels are excellent. Same thing, the phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, boron, sulfur, organic matter, all of those things are great. So I don't need to do anything. I also think part of that is with the tilling, and I know people are in two camps usually, like you're either no-till, you think it's horrible to till the garden, or other people are like, I'm gonna till, I've had good results and it helps me manage everything. Whichever camp you're in, as long as you're growing your own food, I am very happy. So one of the things with tilling though, yes, it can compact soil, not toil. It can compact the soil, and it can also disrupt as the different plants and your fungi and whatnot talk to one another and can be beneficial to one another. Like, I understand the benefits of no-till, and I know it can also take a while to get things established, and that I did not do everything that I should have on this side of the garden on the wood chips that could have helped my nitrogen level stay up where it should have been. But I didn't do any of the work on this side other than tilling, and my nitrogen levels are all very good. Part of that is we're tilling back in the green material, and we're like doing just a once over rough chop throughout the season. And so that green matter is breaking down into the soil when it's green, and with organic matter, as we know, as that breaks down and decomposes, it's releasing nutrients back into the soil. So I think some of the green crops that we've had in here. And I actually didn't do a cover crop this year, but we have naturally chickweed, lamb's ear, plantain, different things like that will take over within the weeds, and those all get chopped up into the soil when we do till, and it's helped keep those nitrogen levels up. Plus it didn't have any of the wood chips on the top level to take any of the nitrogen, with the exception of where I had done wood chips inside. That's last year where I had all of our hog panels and did my trellis system. And I did take some soil samples from that and include it with this, the garden, but that small section, and it was only 1 year instead of 2, didn't seem to impact any of the nitrogen level. So I think I'm still going to keep half of the garden in this plot without wood chips and this part with wood chips, but then amending it correctly this year and adding more. And just running this as a really long experiment. We're 2 years in, and I kind of think it's really fun to see all of the different results and see like how I like certain aspects of it and how it's growing and how it fits for our garden and our time management and all of those things. So the other interesting thing is, though, with the wood chips, is we did wood chip as mulch my high tunnel where we're growing the tomatoes. And so I also did a soil sample and did a test on that. So let's go get those results. Okay guys, so this was brand new soil that we moved the high tunnel to in the tomatoes last year. So it was virgin soil. It had just been pasture and then yard for a couple of years, but it's been predominantly pasture with woods on it until we moved in here and developed this and put our house here, which was about, oh goodness, now when was it, 2005? So there's hundreds and hundreds of years that this had been wooded area. So with the evergreen trees that we have here, it makes the soil slightly acidic naturally and pretty abundant with good growing levels of everything. So last year we put the tomatoes in here. I did add some composted chicken manure and compost when we first tilled this up and to create this area, and then put the high tunnel on top of it. And then I had tomatoes and peppers in here, and we covered it, same thing. We did cardboard the first year and wood chips. This year though, I already put another cover of wood chips on top of here, and we did the soil test. So what's been interesting, because this has only been 1 year, and this is covered. So the rain, because rain will wash nitrogen away. It's one of the reasons it's ideal if you have a compost pile to keep it covered, and nitrogen will naturally leak from the soil as rainfall comes down. So living in the Pacific Northwest, we get a lot of rain. So what's been interesting is, even though this has been wood chips now for 1 year, my nitrogen level is high. It's actually on the high end of the high end at 46 ppms. And then all of my other levels are really good. They're all in the high range where they should be: phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, boron, sulfur. Now what was interesting though is my pH in this area is 5.52, which is a little bit too acidic for tomatoes. So I actually will be adding a little bit of lime, which will add a little bit of extra calcium, even though my calcium level is good. And I don't recommend adding lime to an area unless you know what your pH level is, because it's going to raise the pH level, making it more alkaline. The lower the number, the more acidic. But I found it very interesting that my nitrogen level had stayed so high in here, even though I did have the wood chips. But I think the wood chips have only been on here for 1 year versus 2 years in the other spot of the garden. But I think that the biggest factor in that is I don't have the rainwater that's washing away the nitrogen that is in the soil here for the tomatoes. But I wanted to share that with you because I thought it was very interesting to see all of these three areas. I mean, they're very, very close together. There's literally just feet that are separating them, but each of them had different results when it came to the nitrogen level. And I forgot to mention when we were in the other part of the garden, the pH levels, both the non-wood chipped part of the main vegetable garden and the wood chipped part, both of them are too alkaline. Now the wood chip was actually 7.08, so just barely. A vegetable garden, you want to be between 6.0 and 7.0, so it was just barely over. So I'll put a little bit of elemental sulfur on there and it should come down just fine. And then the part that didn't have wood chips, interestingly, was even a little bit more alkaline than the wood chip part. It's 7.19, so still almost optimal. And with pH levels, I've kind of noticed that as long as it's close to the optimal range, if it's a little bit over, a little bit under, it doesn't really seem to negatively impact things. It's when it's a lot. So if it's like for blueberries, if they should be like a 5 ideally in the 5 range, even down into the 4.5. But if you have an area that's like in the 6 or even close to 7 for blueberries, then you'll really begin to see a negative impact. Blueberries are more acidic than your regular vegetable garden. But if it's too far off one way or the other, it can really affect the plant's ability to draw up the nutrients in the soil if it's not in its optimal pH range. But I did find that was interesting to see the pH differences in the different spots of the garden. If you want to learn more about growing tomatoes both in a high tunnel and or just tying them up, planting a lot of your tomato care, you can check out those videos. And as I mentioned, weed control is one of the reasons that I like the wood chips, and we started using the wood chips. I've got a video that talks about weed control using in both areas of the garden. Go and grab that so that you can stay on top of the weeds and enjoy more of your time in the garden.